It's good that you are all joining on a Tuesday evening. So I appreciate that. Um, I think when people say 2-3 times lot of experience, I think it makes me sound a little old, but I'm very excited to be here. And please feel free to ask questions. I will try to pause after every key point, and I'll look at the chat and try to answer questions. And of course, we will leave some time at the end as well. Um, so, when they reached out to me and said, "Would you talk a little bit about how to build a business model, how to build a business plan, and product market fit, and all of that?" What I thought is I'll start off with a little bit of an intro, so you understand where I'm coming from. I was in the same place that you are, in a way, a long time ago. I think almost 20, 23, 24 years now, when I was in college, and I'll try to relate to actually building a business. And certainly, we will talk about the current situation and how that impacts. And then, of course, talk a little bit of theory in terms of why it's important to do all these things and my perspective on how to deal with this. And you guys are able to see my slides one by one, right? So I'm on the first slide, and then I'll jump to the second one. Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay, perfect. So, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, so you'll get a little perspective. So, like they mentioned, I studied in IIT Bombay. I studied to be an aerospace engineer, and at the time, I was very keen on studying more engineering. So, I applied for scholarship, and I was fortunate enough to get selected on a NASA grant. And I studied at MIT for 2 years. So, this was between 96 and 98. And while that was a great experience in terms of learning, in terms of actually understanding how big the world is, I'd never really been outside of India until I went there to study. Uh, what was even more interesting is the opportunity, even outside of engineering and outside of the education and academia, which I was first exposed to at MIT. And it was also the time when the first real technology boom, which was the dot-com boom, was actually going on. So a lot of startups were getting created. A lot of new value was being generated. The internet had just arrived. So for you guys, it might seem ancient because I think all of you would have been born after that time. But there was a time when there was no internet. And when the internet arrived, I think it created a huge amount of business opportunities. So when I graduated from MIT around that time, I of course learned about all these exciting startups that were getting created in the and I ended up joining a company called MicroStrategy, which was in the data and analytics space, and of course was a late stage startup when I joined back in '98. And I think it was a great ride with a lot of ups and downs, but a lot of learning. So that's where I learned to build products. I learned, a lot of software coding practices. I learned how to create products, build teams, manage teams, all of that from scratch. And of course, none of that I had learned in college. So it was a great experience. And then towards the second half of my time there, I started, aligning myself more to understanding the business of building and selling products. And that's how I got into product management. And I've loved that ever since. And I've been doing that now for the last 10, 15 years. Um, and of course, after that, I worked at other large companies like Oracle. I worked on evaluating acquisitions, acquiring companies, and building businesses. And then I spent some time at a startup in San Francisco. I lived there for a while. And about 6 years ago, I moved back to India. And in India, again, I worked at a late stage startup called Manthan. And then after having done that, I launched a startup of my own, which is still around in the media tech space. And I also spend part of my time consulting with startups, helping them build products and scale, both from sort of concept to launch, as well as people who have products, how to help them scale. So certainly I was very excited when I got this opportunity to share some of my learnings. And hopefully I'm able to do that today, and you find this useful. So, first thing I would say is, it's great. I admire you on the fact that you are here, you are learning, you are actually working to build a business. I understand that some of you have already gone past the stage of ideation and actually started building something. Some of you are in some stage of market or customer validation. So I think that's great. Um, it's a great learning experience, and getting started from scratch while you're in college, I think is a huge learning opportunity. Uh, but similar to some of the questions I received, while it's all great to be an entrepreneur and especially to be a tech entrepreneur or have your own startup, I'm sure you read about that a lot in the press. You also have to take into account the fact that things are a little crazy right now. Right? I think the kind of crisis we are seeing, nobody's seen it. Your parents have also not seen it. Right? There's a crisis on the medical front, there's on an economic front, the whole world is affected, there is a lot of uncertainty. If anything, the last 60 days of lockdown while you are here in India, I think would have really opened up your eyes to how things are changing. And what is interesting even more so is that there is a lot of uncertainty. Right? That when will this crisis end? When will lockdown end? How will the economy behave after that? Will there be an opportunity to create a startup? What kind of business environment will be there in India? What kind of business environment will be there internationally? Um, so I think most of you might be wondering, do you have to be a little crazy to start up? To that, what I would say is that anytime you have to be a little crazy to start up anytime. Maybe even more so now, because of a lot of uncertainty in terms of trends, in terms of the economy, in terms of just simply day-to-day living. Um, but yes, I think it's always you have to be a little crazy to start up, because anytime you do start up, there is always uncertainty. I think it's only increased now because of the current situation. Um, but in a way, lot of times, lot of such crises also create a lot of opportunities. Right? And I don't think it's blanket. Of course, some industries are hurt badly. So it's not that every crisis creates opportunities for everyone. I think it's always a mixed bag. Um, some people and companies will have an upside, others will have a downside, and maybe a few will be just as is. But as an entrepreneur or as somebody looking at creating or building a business, there is a lot that you can find during this time. So one of the ways in which I look at this, based on having seen other types of crisis, is that every such crisis creates a lot of changes, and these changes are in people's behavior. Um, I'm sure all of you are washing your hands more thoroughly and more times a day than ever before. I think all of us have heard more than enough how to sanitize our hands and wash our hands and so on. So from the sort of mundane changes in behavior in terms of health and hygiene, to how businesses are actually operating. Right, a lot of tech businesses have been forced or required to work remotely. Manufacturing in most countries has just started opening up. So each of these has created its own set of challenges and changes in behavior. And every time that happens, that means new opportunities are created. So here are just on this slide, I've just given you a sort of quick overview of what all different areas are changing and possibly what those shifts are. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. I think there is a lot more here. If you go sector by sector, industry by industry, segment by segment. So first is of course people's behavior. In addition to the health and hygiene focus, a lot of people are facing economic hardship. There is a shift in priorities. How each household is spending its budget is shifting. Of course, people are likely buying, a lot more of food and groceries. A lot less for now of sort of optional purchases. Though that may change post lockdown. Businesses are hurt because it's for a lot of businesses been simply difficult to operate a business. If maybe somebody who is in the tech sector, IT sector can probably operate remotely, but if you are in manufacturing, you don't have that luxury, right? You can't run manufacturing, not unless you have all of it built by robots, right? So that is creating a concern. Everybody working remotely has created issues around data security, remote collaboration, of course supply chain, right? So supply chain in general refers to how goods get to your door, right? Both as a household as well as a business, right? So when you are, let's say you buy a pack of biscuits, somebody has to make that biscuit, somebody has to package it, and then somebody has to distribute it before it lands at your nearby store, and then you can get it from there. So that entire process in a nutshell is the supply chain. And the same applies for, what applies to food also applies to all kinds of tech products. Um, in all likelihood, there are certain sectors which will have an upside, and definitely health related technology, pharma, wellness. A lot of these things are going to be in focus because there is so much disruption to how the economy is running. I think likely there will be opportunities created in finance, technology, in insurance, credit, all of those. A lot of people are out of jobs. A lot of people are getting pay cuts. So all these starts creating opportunities in terms of when you look at a business. Certainly some sectors are affected badly. Oil prices have gone down. The travel is essentially shut down for a while and will likely not resume at the same level for a long time to come. Same with hotels and in general anything that requires you to get out of the house. Some sectors are not necessarily up or down, but they are experiencing a change in behavior. So a lot of people who are going out to stores to buy are not going. Delivery has become a focus. Whether it's food delivery, whether it's grocery delivery, whether it's medicine delivery. So a lot of retail behavior is changing. The same is actually happening for banking. So that means these upheavals create opportunities because people are either forced to change a behavior where they're said, don't step out of the house, don't go to the office, don't go to the store, or they are choosing so themselves, right? So if people are afraid of getting infected, they will not venture out as much, which means they will require or expect things to come to them. So all these things actually create opportunities in terms of where a new business can be created, right? I know there were some questions on, hey, I have already started working on an idea now. Will that be relevant with the current crisis? So, we'll sort of keep touching on that. But the key thing is that you will have to validate that. Is that still valid? If you are building something, do people still need that? Do you see that the behavior will remain the same or it will change? So that test is something we'll have to keep checking on each idea. So hopefully this answers some of these sort of early questions in terms of, is this still a good time to start a business? Is there new opportunity? Do you have to pivot? Do you have to change? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think you have to look at, is that business opportunity still valid? Is it changing? If so, how? Or are there better opportunities or newer opportunities that you could address? So I will just pause here for a second and check if we have any questions in the chat. I don't see any. So I think we'll continue. So I think this was actually the question in the first poll. Vikram or Lyle, do we have the results from the poll? What's the most important thing for having a business?
No, so you can ask it now actually. Why don't you ask them to answer in the chat?
Okay, okay. Just a second. Let me go to the chat. So I am typing a question into the chat. Let me see if I can paste the answer. So I think I would request you to give one of these answers. If you can, just type it back into the chat. I hope you guys can see this, what I just typed in. I see one response, 2, 3. Okay, great. Okay. All right, so I think we have about about 12 responses or 13 now. I'll give it a second and then I will pause. Okay. So I think I have roughly, so we have a lot of responses. Sorry, I don't think I can count this while scrolling. But I see that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I think we have about 18 of these, and we have a lot of emphasis on product, which seems to be 1, 2, 3, 6. We have 6 on product, and we have a few on team. 1, 6 on team. I think seems to be quite even, and then of course there is some which says everything. There are some which says timing. There are a few which say I think we have about 5 or 6 which say customer. Right. So this is great. Thanks for typing it in. Sorry it took a while to sort of read and collate that. So let me give you my perspective on that. And this is a quote from Peter Drucker. He's a older school management guru in terms of what it is takes to build an enterprise or a business. And I tend to agree with him, which is the single most important thing is a paying customer and hopefully a happy customer at that, right? So the reason for asking this question is not to determine right or wrong, but is to highlight the point that of course you do need a product or a service, otherwise you have nothing to sell. You of course need a team because who's going to build it and market it and sell it, and of course you need access to capital, and the timing has to be right in order to build a business. None of those are wrong. I think all of those are correct. But if you have an idea, you have a product, you have a team, and even if there is a market, it's not yet a business until you manage to sell it, right? Unless somebody is buying your product and that business or person is happy or satisfied and wants more or can recommend or refer that to others, actually you have not yet created a business. And this is very important to understand, especially at an early stage, because a lot of you are in college, you just start creating a business. There might be, inclination to simply focus on the product because you guys are also adept at the technology side of it. So a lot of you may be focusing on building it. But of course, having a paying customer and a happy customer is crucial because that's when you have the beginnings of a business, right? As a startup. Okay. So, one of the things that you wanted me to talk about was the business model. Right? And I want to take a slightly different look at it. I want to start by, sharing a little survey on what are some of the most common reasons why startups fail. So CB Insights is a data gathering firm. It collects and sells data on variety of factors. So they've been running this survey for a while in terms of talking to startups and figuring out why startups failed by doing a survey of startups, investors, market leaders, and so on. And they publish this survey every few years. So I think this is the most recent one. You can find it yourself. I'm also going to arrange so that you get hold of these slides as well. But if you look at it, the some of the top reasons are no market need. Right? The first number one reason is no market need. That means nobody wanted the product. Right? Whatever was built by the startup, people were simply not interested. That's the biggest reason. That means still a lot of startups create things which people don't want. As in, they may like it, they may be okay with it, but they can do without it. Right? So that's the biggest reason. Other reasons are, of course, not having enough cash, not having the right team, being outsmarted by competition, and so on and so forth. But the key point I want you to take away is that a lot of times products are created, startups are built, but the market need and the customer's need for your product is often not validated. And that's the biggest pitfall, is that people build things which nobody really wants, or rather nobody wants to pay for enough. And then the startup has to fold because they never really got enough traction or not enough response from the market. So one way to start looking at it is to focus on that a lot, right? Is focus on validating the market. So even when you are creating a business model, even when you are talking to your early customers or people who are simply expressing the interest or seeking to understand the problem, a lot of time needs to be spent on validating the need, right? Validating the market, validating the fact that people want your specific product. So one great tool available to do that is to start by building out your business model, right? So I think I'll mention that some of you may have had a class or some exposure on the business model canvas. I think we won't be able to cover all of it, but I'm going to share some links with you in terms of where you can find it. I think it's a simple web search. You will find menu. There are a few different templates available from people who created this concept, startups, venture capital firms, all of those. But what this does is allows you to start at sort of drawing board level to see if you have all the elements of it, right? So certainly at the bottom, you have things like cost structure. How do you how much it takes to build it. You have revenue in terms of how you will get the money, how much you will get it, and so on. And right at the heart of it, I don't know if there is any way to annotate this. Okay, doesn't is the whole idea of a value proposition. Right? Is that means what value are you bringing to customers or businesses or people in terms of what your product or service is. So that's at the core of it. Is the creation of your product and see how it matches. And then, of course, you need to match it to customers. That means some segment of customers. So if, let's say, I'm creating a data security product, or I'm creating a better toothbrush, right? I need to understand who will buy this, right? What is the kind of demographic or a size of business, type of business scale of business or type of person who is likely to buy it, right? So that entire analysis needs to be done and then validate. And then if I am able to say that, okay, hey, this kind of 500 rupee toothbrush will be bought by people who are earning more than 20 lakhs a year or more than 30 lakhs a year, then where are those people? Are they in metros? Are they in India? Are they outside of India? All those questions need to be asked, right? So that's your analysis of the segments. And then, of course, I also need to figure out how will I get my product to the customer, right? My distribution, my partners, in terms of the channels, I think two types of channels. How will I tell people that I have this fancy toothbrush? How will this toothbrush reach them? And then whom will I need to partner? Maybe I need to partner with retail stores. Maybe I need to partner with online grocers. Maybe I need to partner with online retailers like, Flipkart, Amazon, and so on. So who will be my partners and what kind of activities will I do and what kind of access will I need? Will I need any kind of regulatory approval? Will I need a license? All these things. So, if you have not gone through the business model canvas, please go through it. Look at the questions. Each of these sections has a set of questions that you can look at, that you can fill out, and think of this as an iterative exercise, right? So that means not just once, because some of these things can change. A lot of early stage startups realize that the original problem that they started with is not as critical for most consumers or businesses, so they might change the problem. So you might have to come back to this again, or you may have some assumptions which are validated, great. Some assumptions which are invalidated, you need to change your approach. So think of this as like a working document in terms of how you work on it. You start initially and then you go section by section and change it, fill it out, update it every time you learn something new. And then hopefully you start getting to a place where you realize that the product that you are building is actually relevant to a certain segment of customers. And that segment of customers is not only interested in a solution, but they're also interested in your solution. Um, and then I think you start seeing the beginnings of a business. So one more point on the business. I myself was guilty of this when I started in business. That as an engineer, I focused a lot on the product and the product building. And in fact, that's where I started in business, on building the product. And only years later, I started learning the value of sales and marketing. Right? Because if you have a product and nobody knows it, it doesn't matter. So marketing is very important. It's very important to get the word out on what is it that you are creating, why are you creating, who are you, where are you coming from, especially in the early stages in terms of telling your story. Letting people know that you are building this, letting people know that you are solving a problem. All of that, whether it's on social media, whether it's through reach outs, through every possible mechanism where your potential customers are, marketing to them is very important. And then, of course, you need to sell it to them as well. That means you need to explain to them what your product does, what problems it solves, how their needs are met. Because going back to our earlier discussion, unless you have a paying customer, you don't have a business, right? So first of all, you need to build a product that people want and are willing to pay for. You need to let them know that you have this so that they can consider buying your solution. And then, of course, you need to help them buy and then, of course, support it as well. So that's kind of the first section in terms of the model and how to mitigate that risk of the early stage startup, as well as what are some of the key activities. I know we kind of rushed through a lot, but the intent of today's session was to basically give you an idea, and then certainly you can dig a little deeper to understand specifics. So before we jump into product market fit, I'm going to pause here and take a look at some of the questions. Okay. So I have a comment saying that, all the factors for building a business are important, but each has different weights. And I think that's fair. I also have a question from Shubham on that we are working in the railway sector, but our all projects are getting stopped in this lockdown, and we are having challenges in selling to the government and marketing? Okay, very good question. So I think going back to our earlier discussion, is there a disruption? Absolutely, right? So similar to my comments on the idea that travel and hospitality are affected. Of course, government is also effectively shut down during lockdown. I mean, a lot of projects, a lot of activities are cancelled, and in a way, railways is part of the travel sector, one mechanism to travel. So of course, it's affected. But if you look at some of the current press and the announcements, I think there is some semblance of return to where it was, right? So it may not return to how it was earlier, but of course, it's going to get a little better over time, because I think most countries have realized that they can't remain under lockdown or shutdown forever, right? Normal lives need to continue. It might be a so-called new normal or a skewed normal. That means people might need to wear masks, maintain some distance, or there might be temperature checks at every corner and so on. So a lot of that will happen, but most businesses will resume, and so will travel, I think. And initially, when it starts, it will be a little chaotic, like flights opening yesterday or today. Most of them got cancelled, but bit by bit, it will start coming to a better place. And then you'll have to understand that and adjust to it, right? To your specific issue about challenges with government, I don't have sort of off the cuff answer, but what I would recommend is talk to somebody who understands how to deal with the government, somebody who's worked on projects with the government, and seek their guidance in terms of how to navigate this. So expect some delays. I think that's not just for government, but for most businesses are pushing buying decisions to a later time because of the uncertainty, but some of them will come around. So if I don't know what is the specific problem you're solving, but if you anticipate that the problem will remain even after a month or two when things start returning to normal, then likely your idea remains valid. If not, then you need to explore how to pivot. Okay. I think the investors question I will save for later. Okay, I think Sumit's question I'll take later on the investors, but Biswajit's question I will saying, can you talk about how bad is the apparel and dress industry is affected because of the current crisis? Because they're going out may be restricted. Okay, so I will take this question and then we'll jump in. So very good question. In fact, I have I'm working with clients who are in that space. So there are sort of two types of things happening with the apparel industry, and what is happening in India is very different from what is happening internationally. In India, when the lockdown happened, actually e-commerce delivery was mostly stopped, right? Other than essentials, and that too resumed after a couple of weeks. But so-called non-essentials and apparel fell into that category. Purchase, sale, delivery of apparel was stopped. So of course that industry has been hit in India, but in countries outside of India, in many places, e-commerce delivery for apparel, fashion, cosmetics has actually continued. That means people are still able to buy online and get it delivered. And in India also now, as of this week or maybe by next week, you will have some opening up of that, and people will buy. So sort of two trends are happening. One, which you've seen where lockdown has ended, like places like China, there has been so-called vengeance buying. That means, for a couple of months, you don't let people buy. And then when you let them buy, they suddenly go and start buying. They, in fact, buy a little more than what they had planned because they're happy to get out and they're happy to get into the stores and buy some more, right? So that's sort of human psychology. But once that has happened and that sort of spike has abated, there will likely be some real changes in terms of the kind of apparel, so assortment, right? What kind of apparel people buy will change. If you don't have to go out as much to the office, then you probably don't need as many jackets and suits or fine dresses, but you might be, more focused on finding comfortable attire. So there are two sets of changes. One is the kind of assortment, and the other is the buying itself, the process of buying. So whether people will buy online, store, or some combination thereof, whether people will buy online but pick up at a nearby store, or will the stores give curbside delivery? So some of these things under the, so if you look at search for omni-channel, search for, sort of hybrid models of buying and delivery, I think that will give you some idea as to the trends. Specific to retail, check out RIS News. That's a site. I will just type it in there. So if any of you are building businesses that tailor to retailers, check out risnews.com. It's a US focused site, but gives you a lot of trends internationally. And keep in mind that retail in India is very different from international retail. Okay. So I will stop the questions here and we'll go back to the questions again at the end. And we'll jump into the next part of our conversation on product market fit. So, product market fit in the sort of world of business or startup is, maybe a little bit newer. Still, it's about now 10 or 15 years old. So here I have shown you quotes from a few people. So the first one of them, Andy Rachleff, is actually the person who coined the term product market fit, right? And he did that on the basis of his experience working with a venture capital firm. And he said, that's one of the ways in which they evaluate business. Has that business reached product market fit? Is it likely to reach product market fit, or will never reach it, and so on? So they use that as a mechanism to evaluate whether a business will scale. Right? So venture capitalists are not interested in businesses that just run, but they are interested in businesses which scale, because that is their financial incentive to multiply the growth of a company. So that's where the term product market fit came from. And then, of course, now it has become part of the lexicon. All startups talk about it. All startups discuss it. So, of course, it matters. And one way to look at it is that, like what Mark Andreessen says, or even what Sam Altman of Y Combinator says, that there is a way in which your business operates until you get to product market fit. Right? There is a lot of, and that's what I will talk about in the next couple of slides as to, what is that process. But that's a key milestone in a business, right? And it's not necessarily time bound. It's kind of a stage that you reach where the product that you have, people or businesses are so interested in that you don't need to worry about getting orders. All you have to do is focus on fulfillment. That means you're just focusing on selling and servicing your customers. But it takes a while, or it takes some iterations before you get there. And once you have it, then the problem is very different. So until you get to product market fit, the primary problem for a startup is to figure out how do they get to product market fit, right? That means figure out, what is the product they should build, who should they build it for, how should it be delivered, all of those issues. And then when they hit product market fit, the problem becomes different. Now it's more about how do they scale, how do they market more, how do they get, increase their sales volume, how do they increase their production, if that makes sense. So these things are, sort of a stage in it. And the next couple of slides, I'll try to explain as best as possible, what that is. But definitely there are a lot of books, a lot of good materials, a lot of good worksheets available on evaluating this, so that you can determine for yourself, how to get to that. So another very good resource on this, and I think I've included in the reading list at the end as well, is a book called The 4 Steps to the Epiphany. It was written by Steve Blank, who's an entrepreneur himself, and then he became more of an educator and teacher on this whole idea of product market fit. And in fact, he was the person who coined the term called customer development. In which, if you look at it, it's the whole journey of the early stage startup is divided into 4 buckets. Right? First is customer discovery and validation. That's number 1, number 2. And then the other 2 are customer creation and company building. So in a way, if you look at the first 2 steps, this is where a lot of the early stage startups are, right? That means they are still discovering who their customers are, what the problems are, their early problems, they are validating, and they're also seeing if customers will pay for that. and whether the solution that your specific company is building, your startup, your product, is that actually a need in the market, right? So this kind of validation is what happens in the early stages, where it's your customer discovery and validation phase. And it's an iterative process, right? So you see there is a little bit of loop. That means you start somewhere and then you might end up somewhere else as you actually learn about the customer, learn about the market, learn about the need. And once you get past that stage, then it becomes a very different process, which is the post product market fit, about scaling and building a company and so on. This is very crucial in terms of, so I highly recommend reading that book, and I've included the detail at the end as well. I think we're running a little slow, so I will skip this slide, but I'm going to share this deck with you. So one way to look at this is to sort of break it down into a more linear journey. Even though we talked about the idea that, hey, it's not really linear. There will be iterations and you might have some of the steps go wrong and you will come back to it and so on. A lot of that is going to happen. But one way to sort of break it down into stages neatly, as a sort of academic matter, is in this manner, right? So kind of your stage 0 is hunch on a problem. That means you think this is a problem. Let's say somebody says, okay, hey, I need a faster way to achieve ABC. So this is something I know now, which is my hunch. Then I go out there and I talk to people. I talk to actually individual customers, users, consumers, or I go talk to businesses to start validating. And actually, maybe I gain some insights on that, hey, I don't need just faster, I also need safer, right? Or I already have a fast mechanism, but that's too expensive. So all these kinds of things you will learn through that process of actually discovering and talking to customers, right? Potential customers at that stage. And then you have the so-called concept of the minimum viable product. That means now you get to a stage where you are saying, hey, that particular problem, this is a solution for, not the only solution, but a solution. And of course, there could be other solutions for that in the market. So if I were to take the example of, I want to get from home to my college faster. Now, home to college faster could be done through a variety of mechanisms. Already there is a bus service, there's a taxi service, there is a metro service. I can buy my own vehicle. A lot of mechanisms exist, and each of those mechanisms has certain problems. But if I want to invent a new way, like let's say I want to invent like an electric scooter, or I want to invent the hyperloop for getting from one place to the other, then I need to assess whether that's actually a better solution, whether that's a more desirable solution. And I also need to, if you look at the bottom, feasible solution, right? That means one is technical feasibility at my end to produce it, and also feasibility in terms of whether the customer is willing to pay for it, right? Do they have the kind of budget to pay for it? So on both ends, the feasibility needs to be evaluated. And that's the minimum viable product concept actually comes from that. So I actually create something and put it out there so that I actually get the feedback from people, both in terms of whether they're buying it and those who buy it, how can they use it. Right? And that stage, then the iterations start in terms of building a better product, or if I'm getting some parts of it wrong, then how do I change it? I'm actually getting now real feedback. Some of this can be achieved even with a prototype in the early stages, but some of it may actually require a working product. Right? So even before you build a minimum viable product, a lot of validation can be done in certain sectors, especially in the tech businesses, with a prototype, if possible. And then you actually go to the minimum viable product, and then you start testing it with some of the early adopters. What is termed here beta testing. And then in some of those iterations, then you hit a kind of a sweet spot where what you are building actually works really well for solving that problem. And a lot more people want it because now you validated both the desirability, feasibility, and also viability. That's when you hit the so-called product market fit. And really then it's all about managing the growth. So this early journey is very important. And note that, 0 and 1 are really more about having an hypothesis or having a hunch, validating that with customers, and then building an early stage product, which is called stage 2 problem solution fit. And then you go through a series of iterations before you hit a product market fit. So I want to pause here for a second and actually draw this point out, that because one customer or two customers have bought a product is not a product market fit. Right? You have a product solution fit. That means what you are creating is actually solving a problem, and is solving a problem for those many customers. When you see that your solution or your offering is actually solving the problem not just for these one or two, but for maybe 10, 100 or 1,000 potential customers, that's, and they are specifically interested in your solution, is when you hit that product market fit. So this is often, confused a little bit. So I'm trying to explain that a bit. That having a paying customer is not equal to product market fit. Having the potential to have tens, hundreds, or thousands of potential paying customers and them being interested in your specific solution is actually product market fit. So I'll spend a minute here talking about this idea of iteration. That means, this is what I think a lot of early stage startups need to be prepared for. Is you may not, sort of get to it in the first shot. Right? That means there is an iterative exercise. So you have a hunch, you build something, you design it, you build it, you put it out there. Maybe it gets bought, maybe it gets bought but not used well, or it is only partially satisfactory. You learn from that experience from the early adopters or your first few paying customers, and then loop back in, and then keep building better. And that exercise, this looping around, is very crucial in the early stages and needs to be done systematically. Right? If you are able to do this systematically, in all likelihood, you will get to product market. Right? So that's the most, sort of important iterative stage of an early stage startup. And, typically it's not a smooth ride. Right? So the ride for getting to product market fit, usually appears very neat in the books and blogs and materials. But my take on it in the real world is more like snakes and ladders. Right? So if you ever played this board game, you know that it's not just about throwing additional numbers before you get to 100. Sometimes you might get lucky, or you might do something right and you will go faster. You might do something wrong and you will sink back down. So in the real world, getting to product market fit is a lot like this. It's not just a straightforward linear process. There are expected and unexpected ups and downs before you get to a fit like that. So before sort of taking more questions, I'll leave you with one parting thought. Since I came to you here as a bit of an expert and shared some of my thoughts, please, read by all means, talk to others, get input from others, but take the time to evaluate that. Right? See if that makes sense for you. Because in a way, if you are spending time on your business, your product, your idea, you are likely the only person, or your team is the only likely group which knows the most about it. And if you're talking to your early customers and potential customers, then you have the best understanding of how that business is getting affected. So certainly you can take guidance from a lot of people, you can take ideas from a lot of people, but it's important that you evaluate that for yourself. And that's where all these frameworks start making sense, right? Your business model framework, your PMF framework, value proposition framework, all these frameworks sort of help you evaluate and understand it, as well as pitch your solution in the right way. And I know we tried to sort of squeeze in a lot of material during this time. So I'm going to share with you a few links, and I think I'm going to request Vikram and Lyle to share this deck with you as well. So you can go back and, if you are a blog reading type, I think some of these links will be very useful. There are a few more of those, but I have found these to be very useful, especially in the early stages. And if you are the book reading type, then here are 3 books which I like. In terms of building the product, I think a couple of the graphics I showed you were from Steve Blank's 4 Steps to the Epiphany. And 0 to 1, of course, is the Peter Thiel book on, sort of creating sort of net new ideas and developing those. If you are in the tech product space, definitely reading Hooked by Nereal is very interesting in terms of how to create habit forming products. And then of course a lot others are there, but especially the first two I would recommend, just in terms of sort of understanding. And as you read those, you will likely, it will resonate with you in terms of where you are at, what stage of the business you are, and how you will get from that stage to the next one. So we'll share that with you. And we'll go to the questions. I see a couple more. I think, in fact, there were a few more from earlier. So I will try to go through some of these questions and try to answer those best. So I think I covered the question from Biswajit on Parallel. I think I have a question from Ashwin on, can you share some of the innovative and effective marketing in your perception? Very good question. Rather broad. So, the type of marketing and promotion you do depends on the kind of product and kind of target market. That means if you are, of course, targeting individual consumers, then probably targeting them through social media and advertising is a great mechanism, right? That means, depending on, let's say, if your audience is in the 30 to 50 age bracket, then you might want to advertise on Facebook or promote yourself on Facebook. If maybe your audience is younger than that, in the teens and 20s, I think a lot of teens and 20s don't use Facebook as much. I think they rely more, from what I understand, they use Instagram, Snapchat, and a few other mechanisms. So then you need to be on the channels where your potential users are. On the other hand, if you are selling to businesses, a lot of businesses are on LinkedIn and Twitter. So your channels, you need to choose accordingly. And then the type of marketing you do, again, needs to be tailored to the kind of people you want to reach to. So if you go back to the canvas, you are looking at customer segment. So understanding your customer segment, and the next step is to understand where that target segment is, will allow you to choose the right channel and the kind of marketing you should. So hopefully that answers your question. I know that's a brief answer to a very expansive question. Okay. I have one more question from Shubham saying, how do I learn to sell and market better? Because most engineers are able to design the product but unable to sell them. I think excellent question. So I think a lot of it can be achieved in two ways, just like anything you learn, right? One is you learn by reading and practice. That means you can learn about how it is that other people market. You can read books on marketing, read books on storytelling, which is now an in thing. How do you tell your product or business story better? And the same thing with selling. You can learn, that's one way. You can take classes. You can talk to experts. You can watch videos, and then again go and try that out. So one of the ways in which I learned to present better was to read books, and then take the do practice presentations at home in front of the mirror, and then actually go out and practice that in the field. Practice that at work, practice that with potential customers, and then refine that. So as with anything else, your mechanisms for learning is get hold of books, read materials, try it out and practice, talk to people who know more than you, learn from them, and most importantly, practice, right? So a lot of these business lessons, you will get better as you put them into practice and figure out what works and what doesn't work for you. I think I see a couple more questions. Okay. I think from Sahil, I have a question which says, I have a doubt that how business, product market, and social product are different if the product is related to social problems.
So I think he means B2B versus B2C. Is that the question?
No,
or
I
you
think
can answer both.
Yeah, no, I don't think it sounds more like social product means some kind of social business. That means it seeks to do greater good, and necessarily nobody will be looking to buy it. Sahil, if you're there, can you just add a line? I think, do you mean that it's something which, yeah, okay. So I think he's saying it's right. So it's a social business. That means it's, trying to achieve some kind of a greater good instead of simply being sold. So very interesting question. I think clearly some of the paying customer part doesn't necessarily apply here, because you're not expecting your customers to buy, but you are still looking for usage, right, and satisfaction. So the part about paying part goes away, but satisfied or happy customer still remains, because let's say you are creating something which addresses a social issue. Right? So let's say, as an example, I will say better access to water, right, which in India in a lot of places you don't have. And you're not just necessarily looking to sell water, but maybe you go and start educating people on how to do water harvesting better, or you help them create mechanisms through which they can store the water better, clean it better, manage the water supply. A lot of startups are operating in that space as well. Now, the way to measure effectiveness is going to depend on the specific social startup, but two things matter. Are you achieving the end goal that you wanted, which may be a village or a town or a locality with a better water supply, and how effective that is, right? That means, are those people able to actually get access to the water supply, and are they actually willing to change in order to get to that, right? So that if your product or your offering makes sense, then people will be willing to acquire it. That means they will either volunteer their time, spend money, or adopt it, right? So each of these mechanisms or metrics could be a way to measure the success. It's not just revenue, but the adoption part, whether it's for businesses where you're selling it in terms of product market fit, or whether it's a social product where you're trying to evaluate product market fit, the adoption will be key. The paying part may not matter as much here, because maybe you're not charging, though there are social enterprises which also charge for the product, but maybe it's discounted or subsidized. So adoption, I think, is one key metric in which to measure success, which can apply even to social enterprises. So hopefully that answers your question adequately. Then we have one more question on from David, saying, I'm trying to build a product that needs implementation of a very recent research into mass manufacturing. It's a special material that can be fabricated, but I need to scale it up. Okay. Whether new researchers should be implemented practically. Okay. Very, very good question. On, especially if I have something at the research stage, is it ready for business scale? Right? Because there are certain ways in which you operate in a research environment, whether it's technical research, manufacturing research, or software research. And you still need to do the real world testing, right? That means, is this something that will be valid in the real world? So I will go back to that earlier pointers on customer validation and customer discovery. That means, and then the viability aspect. So if I'll just go to the slide earlier here on this front. So let's say something is valid in a research environment, it also needs to be valid in the real world. That means, can this be actually built or distributed or created in the real world for a certain cost? So that validation needs to occur in terms of manufacturing or special materials. And then the other viability, first is the feasibility. That means, first of all, does anybody want it? That desirability. Are you able to build it and deliver it is the feasibility. And then the viability part is, are actually people willing to acquire it, and can that be managed and maintained? So at least in the early stages, the desirability and the feasibility needs to be validated. That means, if you are saying it's special materials or special ways to build something, can that be actually done? Right? So can that be, so let's say if you are fabricating a new chip, right? Can you actually build a lab or get access to a lab where it can be fabricated? If you are saying, okay, I'm going to create a new robot. Now, is there a mechanism available to build that robot? In India, in China, somewhere else? And then can I actually manufacture that for a certain cost, so that I can actually sell it at a price which my market is willing to pay? So you need to go through that process, which is iteration, in terms of figuring out whether there is a need and how will that be validated. So some of the same framework applies, though you need to look at the specifics of your product and industry. I have one more question from Sudyut on, can you share your experience of getting into MIT? Okay. Uh, I'll just tell you one story there. So when I was in college, I wasn't sure actually, right until the third or fourth year, what I wanted to do. And like everybody else, I was oscillating between studying more or doing an MBA or taking up a software job, which was definitely growing at that time. So I think it took me a while to figure out what I wanted to do. And then while sort of debating that, I discovered a couple of interesting areas for research. These were, I think, back then called smart structures, which were sort of aircraft and space structures embedded with sensors, which is similar, very similar to the current IoT concept. But the aircraft and spacecraft have had it for a long time. So when I hit upon that, I think it really sort of struck me, and then that kind of motivated me to make a pitch, and then effectively tell my story to the selectors and admission coordinators on what I wanted to do, why I wanted to do it. And then when I graduated, I actually took a year to get exposure to what it is like to do research, and I spent one more year in Bombay doing research, and I actually got some hands-on experience, and that then validated my sort of desire and need in terms of doing more research. And I think in a way that helped me to get selected and so on. So thank you for asking that. I think we have one more question. I think that looks like the last question, which is from Nitish, which is, can you figure out the factors which should be more focused while working on government-based startups and how to deal with government? Okay. So, by no means am I an expert on dealing with the government, and most of my experiences haven't been as pleasant. But what I would say is that please, talk to someone who has done business with the government. Of some of my friends and former colleagues who are doing business with the government, there are certain ways in which you need to operate with the government. They almost have their own rule book, both the published one and the non-published one in terms of how to deal with it. So please talk to businesses who have done business, who have worked with the government, both to build products or build services for the government, and then also in terms of how to work with them on a commercial basis. So please take input from those people who have done that sort of thing before. Try to find other startups or other product or service companies in your space or sector or related sectors. Please reach out to their founders or leaders and see if they will spend a few minutes with you on the phone or Skype or something like that. I think those would be two mechanisms through which you can search. And then once you get to that, a lot of governments at the national and state level also have different sort of departments or functions which are devoted to working with academia, which are devoted to working with startups, also in India as well as outside. And some of them offer grant programs and things like that. So please take time to research that. I think some of these incubators that you're participating, as well as NASSCOM programs for students and startups, also provide access to some of this information. So mind that and learn from that to see if you can, get a little better at it. Okay. I think
Thank
it
you so
looks
much,
like
I think that's the end of the questions there. Would you be okay with another 10 minutes? A couple more questions that I have from my side that some students have asked before.
Sure, yeah. I'm okay to go on for another few minutes. If there are a couple more questions which I missed or there are more coming, I'm happy to answer those. Yeah.
Cool. So I have one question from my side, which is, in this time, how would you recommend, if you could, not in terms of tell us, but some hacks that you might have figured out in terms of meeting your customer? Because right now it's very difficult to actually find your customer. And if you could highlight some difference between B2B and B2C in terms of how you test it. So when it's B2C, I think people tend to, go to their friends often for feedback. Is that a good idea? How is it different for B2B?
Sure. So very good question. And I think this is a challenge not faced just by startups, but all businesses, right? And I think in a way, it's creating one barrier because you cannot physically go and meet your customers. So that's a practical challenge. I think in some cases you might be able to meet your customer, on the phone or through some kind of video conferencing. That might be possible in some cases. So a lot of businesses are adopting that mechanism. In other cases, you might have a proxy. That means you will have to, reach out to people who have access to customers to see if they will get that information. Or in some cases, if that is not possible, then you will simply have to wait until physical, meetings are available. But a lot of businesses are currently marketing and selling through social media, through email, phone, and video conferencing. In fact, one sort of the flip side of this is earlier you may not have been able to market and sell as easily outside of your geography. That means, let's say you are sitting here in India, it might have been challenging for you to go and sell and market to customers in the US or Europe because you could not, you don't have the budget to go and travel there. Right? But now some of those same people might be a little more accessible to you in case you are a B2B or looking to target international base to reach out. So I have worked with startups who are now having a little easier time getting meetings outside of the country because of the current crisis, and physical presence is not required. So I would say that it's sort of a mixed bag. In some cases, you might be able to achieve it through any of these technologies. In some cases, might actually open up other geographies for you. But in some cases, unfortunately, you will simply have to wait until you can do that. Yeah. Any other question? Right.
Awesome, thanks. So the next from the students. So one question is, how do you become an agripreneur?
Sorry, say that again.
Do you know anything about agripreneur, probably an entrepreneur in the agricultural space?
Okay, yeah, sorry, I don't have any direct exposure to the agri business, but I would direct you to actually work with, if Cisco incubator doesn't have it, certainly NASSCOM is supporting a lot of agri businesses. There is a whole team devoted to doing business for Bharat, and some of those are actually agri businesses. So I would say please look at that. There are also agri-business focused accelerators. Some of them have partnered with NASSCOM. So I would say that's the second mechanism. And then there are also sort of, to earlier some of the questions, there are agri-focused venture capitalists and social focused venture funds also. So I would say look at all these resources. And then most importantly, try to find others who are operating in that business. If you are on LinkedIn, search there, you will find plenty of people who are operating. And most entrepreneurs, might be pressed for time, but you can, if you are persistent, they will definitely spend some time talking with you in terms of how they are running their activity. So hustle. Look at these 2-3 different mechanisms to get hold of some information. Yeah.
Okay. Next is, sir, tell us a bit about your NASA experience and the US environment, and what type of technology is currently used in space communication.
Unfortunately, I'm a little out of touch with the space communication part. It's been now almost 20 plus years, but I'll try to answer the first couple. So in terms of my experience working on the NASA project, of course, it was a huge learning experience. In terms of two things, one is, I think that's the first time I got to understand how research itself works, right? So whether it's NASA research or corporate sponsored research, most of these research grants are given with a set of objectives that you need to accomplish and a budget, right? Which in that case, the professor I worked with managed. And then, you can do the research as long as the budget allows for it. So that was the one part in terms of being able to sort of understand how to do research rather than just flat out idea of just doing research where you are not actually building any experiments, right? So while you are doing research where you are simply reading and modeling, I think a lot less budget is required. For the kind of research I worked on, I needed to design experiments. And then there were constraints on how much money I could spend. So I had to get creative at times in terms of how I designed experiments. And the other sort of part, whether it's a positive or a negative that I learned was that, a lot of so when you think of NASA research, it sounds very cool and exciting. Of course, I was very excited. But a lot of times the day-to-day part it takes a while before you sort of hit any kind of wow moments, right? So a lot of the day-to-day routine of a researcher, very similar to that of building a business, is mundane, right? That means exciting things don't necessarily happen every day. You don't necessarily discover new things. You don't necessarily win new deals or have breakthroughs every day. So a lot of it takes discipline in terms of being able to sort of work through that. So you need to have a mechanism through which you, just like how you build your business, you do your research. That means you keep at it. You keep learning new things. You keep trying new things. You keep coming up with new ways in which to solve problems. So I would say the other part I learned through that was discipline, because not every day is equally exciting. But when you spend the time and kind of do your work in a systematic manner, hopefully you hit some insights, breakthroughs, or crack some new deals. Yeah. Thank you.
Super. Okay, cool. The last question I think we'll take is, what is the future of aerospace, you think, as a for a startup to pursue in India right now?
Sure. Very good question. Again, I'm not deeply in touch with it, but I'm in touch with it in terms of what I see and read. So I think two things have happened in the last few years, which I think make it a very interesting opportunity to do a startup in the aerospace business. Right. One is the government has opened up a lot. Right. So earlier, a lot of aerospace manufacturing and support was actually only with government entities. Over the last few years, private entities in India are allowed into the aerospace business. Right. And because they have allowed that, other governments have also allowed businesses in India to support their aerospace industry. Right? So it's a two-way opening. Because India opened up, that's an opportunity. So now you can support the Indian aerospace demand out of India. And also because that has opened up, now you can also supply to aerospace businesses outside of it. So that's one positive factor which is helping. Uh, the second part that is helping is there are actually now dedicated locations. So if you are into manufacturing some kind of aerospace, there are CEZ or special economic zones similar to software that have been created now for aerospace, which means there are certain economic benefits. There is some access to capital, access to resources, access to space, all of that has happened. So I think that has opened up. So there are a couple of good things that have happened in the last few years, which I think make it very interesting to create something in the aerospace business. What continues to remain a challenge is who is your customer. Right? So a lot of aerospace purchases are still done by governments. Of course, if you are in the aircraft or related business, purchases are being done by airlines or other transport vehicles. But a lot of aerospace, especially if it's geared towards defense, the buyers are still governments. And operating with the government, like a couple of others highlighted, continues to be a challenge and requires a sort of steep learning curve. But to the extent that you intend to build something and sell to businesses, I think there is a lot of opening up both in India and then access to foreign markets. So of course it depends on your specific problem or product or opportunity. But I think the environment for creating a aerospace focused business in India now is a lot better, way better than where it was a few years ago. Yeah. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you so much. I think we all learned a lot today. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone, if you guys are, the next webinar under the NASSCOM series, business series, is company registration, legal compliance, and intellectual property. So stay tuned to the series. The PPT is in the chat here. If you ever, his contact information is also there. So if you guys want to hit him up, you can email him there and keep the PPT as a reference. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank you so much, Kaustubh. Really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.
All right. Thank you.